There are places in Australia that were burned down on government orders in the dead of night, while the families who lived there watched from the darkness. There are places surrounded by barbed wire, built specifically to hold children who had been taken from their mothers. And there are places that don't appear in most history books at all, even though what happened inside them shaped the entire country. This isn't a story about towns that simply faded away. This is a story about towns that were erased on purpose. Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to walk through 14 of these places, missions, reserves, and settlements scattered from the tropical north to the southern coast, and uncover what really happened inside their fences. Some of these communities fought back and won. Some were destroyed within a single night. All of them tell a part of Australia's history that was, for a long time, deliberately left out of the record. So here's the question worth sitting with as we go. Which of these 14 settlements were so successful, so self-sufficient, that the government saw it as a threat worth destroying? And which one operated behind barbed wire as a detention center for children? Let's find out. To understand these 14 places, you need to understand the system that created them. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Australian state governments established a network of missions, reserves, and stations where Aboriginal people were required, often by law, to live. Some of these were run by churches, others were run directly by government departments known as Aborigines Protection Boards. On paper, they were framed as places of care and provision. In practice, they functioned as instruments of control over movement, over marriage, over wages, and eventually over families themselves. Residents needed written permission to leave. Rations were used as leverage to enforce obedience, and, in the most devastating cases, children were forcibly removed from their parents under official policy, a practice that created what is now known as the stolen generations. This wasn't hidden history in the sense of being secret. It was recorded in parliamentary papers, mission logs, and police records. It was simply left out of the story most Australians grew up hearing. What makes these 14 places so important is what happened inside them beyond the policy documents. Some became sites of extraordinary economic success, which government administrators found threatening rather than encouraging. Others became flashpoints of protest that changed national law. And a few were the settings for some of the darkest chapters in the country's history. We're beginning on the banks of the Murray River, at the site of a protest that is now recognised as the first mass strike by Aboriginal people in Australian history. Cummeragunja was established on the Murray River as a mission for the Yorta people, operating under the strict oversight of the New South Wales Aborigines Protection Board. Life on the mission was tightly regulated. Rations were often inadequate. Work was frequently unpaid or underpaid, and by the late 1930s, conditions under the mission's manager had become so harsh that residents described the atmosphere as close to unbearable. In February 1939, that pressure reached its breaking point. In an act of coordinated defiance, roughly 200 residents walked off the mission entirely, crossing the Murray River into Victoria to escape the board's jurisdiction and publicly protest their treatment. It became known as the Cummeragunja Walk-Off, and it's now recognised as the first mass strike undertaken by Aboriginal people anywhere in the country, a direct, collective refusal to keep enduring conditions imposed from above. The walk-off didn't just make a statement in the moment. It planted seeds that would grow into decades of organised Aboriginal rights activism across Australia, with several participants going on to become influential figures in a broader movement for recognition and justice. What began as an act of desperation on a fenced riverbank became, in hindsight, a founding moment of modern Indigenous political resistance. That same pattern, a community pushed past its limit, plays out again in our next stop, though this time the response didn't come from the residents. It came from the state itself with terrifying speed. Mapoon began in 1891 as a Presbyterian mission on the western coast of Cape York, and over the following decades it grew into something genuinely rare, a largely self-sufficient Aboriginal community with its own economy, its own housing, and a strong sense of permanence. For generations it was simply home. That permanence was shattered in 1963. Valuable bauxite deposits had been discovered beneath and around the settlement, and the Queensland government, working alongside the mining company that would become Comalco, moved to clear the land for extraction. What followed was not a negotiation or a resettlement program in any meaningful sense, Police entered Mapoon and set fire to homes, burning the mission to the ground while residents were forcibly relocated, some watching their houses destroyed as they were removed from the area. The justification offered was economic development. The reality was the deliberate destruction of a functioning community to clear the path for a mining lease. Mapoon stands as one of the starkest documented examples in Australian history of a black community being erased not through neglect, but through direct, coordinated government and corporate action. A legally established town wiped out almost overnight. From a coastline scarred by fire, we move inland now to a very different kind of institution. One that didn't burn anyone out because it never let them leave in the first place. In 1910, the Western Australian government established Moola Bulla in the East Kimberley, officially as a cattle station. Unofficially, it functioned as something closer to a state-run labour camp. Vast stretches of traditional land were absorbed into the property, and Aboriginal people from the surrounding region were brought onto the station to work, frequently without meaningful wages, under conditions dictated entirely by government administrators. The station was framed publicly as a benevolent enterprise, providing food, shelter, and employment. In practice, it entrenched total dependency. Workers had little control over their movement, their pay, or the fate of their own families, and children raised on the station grew up inside a system explicitly designed to keep them there. It was a pastoral enterprise built on the same logic as a reservation: controlled labor, controlled lands, controlled lives. Moola Bulla operated for over 4 decades before the government abruptly closed and sold the station in 1955, displacing the very workforce it had spent generations making dependent on it. There was no meaningful transition plan. People who had lived their entire lives on land the government now considered surplus were simply told to leave. From a Kimberley cattle empire built on unpaid labor, we travel south to Victoria, where one community didn't just survive the system, it outperformed it, and paid a heavy price for doing so. Coranderrk was established in 1860 and 1933 in Ensville, largely through the efforts of Wurundjeri leaders who successfully petitioned for land where their community could live and work with a genuine degree of self-determination. What happened next surprised and eventually threatened the colonial authorities who oversaw it. Coranderrk became remarkably productive, winning awards at agricultural exhibitions for its hops and grain, and generating real income that residents themselves helped manage. That success became a problem. A thriving, self-sufficient Aboriginal community directly contradicted the colonial narrative used to justify controlling Indigenous people in the first place. In 1881, residents took the extraordinary step of travelling to Melbourne to testify before a parliamentary inquiry, publicly detailing mismanagement and mistreatment by their overseers, a bold act of political organising decades before Aboriginal people had any formal political rights. The victory was short-lived. In 1886, Victoria passed what became known as the Aborigines Protection Act, informally called the Half-Caste Act, which forced many mixed-descent residents off reserves like Coranderrk entirely, fracturing the very community that had built the station's success. The land was gradually sold off in the decades that followed. Coranderrk remains one of the clearest examples in Australian history of a community punished, not for failure, but for proving the system's justification was a lie. From a hop farm dismantled by legislation, we head to the Lower Murray, where a mission became something closer to a cultural birthplace. Established in 1859 on the shores of Lake Alexandrina, Point Macleay, now known by its traditional name, Raukkan, operated as a mission under close religious and governmental supervision. Language restrictions, controlled housing, and strict oversight of daily life were standard features of existence there, part of a broader effort to reshape residents according to colonial expectations. And yet, from within that tightly controlled environment, something extraordinary emerged. Raukkan became the birthplace of David Unapon, an inventor, writer, and preacher whose intellectual contributions were so significant that his portrait now appears on the Australian $50 note, making him one of the most recognized Aboriginal figures in the nation's modern currency and history. He was far from the only influential figure the mission produced. Raukkan became a wellspring for generations of Aboriginal leaders, artists, and advocates who carried its legacy into broader Australian public life. The tension at the heart of Raukkan's story is a haunting one. A place built to suppress cultural identity instead became a training ground for some of the very people who would go on to challenge that suppression most effectively. From a mission that shaped national icons, we travel north to the tropical coastline, where control took a far more physically enforced form. Wyndham, perched on Western Australia's remote northern coastline, grew around a busy port economy tied to paling and shipping. That economy relied heavily on Aboriginal labour, and the town itself was structured around strict racial segregation. Aboriginal reserve areas sat apart from the main township, subject to curfews, movement restrictions, and rationing systems that governments used as tools of control rather than genuine welfare provisions. Life in this environment meant contending with brutal tropical heat, unpredictable seasonal flooding, and a rigid set of rules dictating where residents could go, when, and under what conditions. Workers contributed directly to the industries that kept Wyndham economically viable, while being formally excluded from the social and civic life of the town they helped sustain. The segregation here wasn't incidental, it was structural, embedded into how the port town itself was planned and administered. Wyndham stands as a clear example of how Australia's frontier economies frequently depended on Aboriginal labour, while simultaneously enforcing legal and physical separation from the communities providing it. From a segregated northern port, we head south into Victoria's forested east, to a settlement whose residents responded to threatened closure with something the government hadn't planned for: outright refusal. Gazetted in 1861 in the forested Gippsland region of Victoria, Lake Tyers became one of the state's principal Aboriginal reserves, drawing residents from multiple displaced communities forced off their traditional lands elsewhere. For decades, it operated under standard mission oversight. But as the 20th century progressed and successive governments pushed to close or consolidate Aboriginal reserves across the state, Lake Tyers residents made a decision that set them apart. They refused to leave. Repeatedly, across multiple decades, authorities attempted to disperse the community, and repeatedly, residents organized, protested, and simply stayed put, even as resources and support were deliberately withdrawn to pressure them out. This sustained grassroots resistance eventually contributed to a landmark outcome. In 1971, ownership of Lake Tyers was formally transferred to its Aboriginal residents, making it one of the first significant land rights victories of its kind in the state. Lake Tyers is a story about endurance functioning as strategy. While other communities were scattered by policy and force, this one held its ground long enough to outlast the very governments trying to remove it. Proof that persistence, on its own, could sometimes become a form of political power. From a community that won its land back, we shift to rural New South Wales, where segregation wasn't hidden in policy documents. It was built directly into the architecture of everyday town life. In towns like Collarenebri on the Barunga River in northern New South Wales, segregation wasn't an abstract legal concept. It was something residents encountered constantly in ordinary daily spaces. Local cinemas commonly enforced separate seating areas for Aboriginal patrons. Public swimming areas were frequently divided along racial lines. And Aboriginal families were often required to live in fringe camps on the outskirts of town, physically separated from the main township, despite being central to its economy and community life. This pattern wasn't unique to Collarenebri, but it was starkly representative of how deeply structural segregation ran through rural Australian towns well into the 1960s, decades after similar practices had become internationally notorious in other parts of the world. These restrictions weren't relics of a distant colonial past, they were current, lived experiences for people well within living memory today. It was precisely this kind of entrenched rural segregation that would later draw national attention through civil rights activism, as organizers began traveling through towns like Collarenebri to publicly document and challenge these everyday divisions. The mission and its surrounding fringe camps stand as a reminder that erasure didn't always look like a burned building. Sometimes it looked like a locked gate at the edge of a swimming hole. From riverside segregation in the east, we head into the red dust of the Western Desert, where an entirely different kind of settlement was forming, one built not by government order, but by people walking away from it. In the wake of the landmark 1966 Wave Hill walk-off, when Aboriginal stockmen and their families across the Kimberley and Northern Territory began leaving pastoral stations en masse to protest unpaid labour and demand equal wages, Similar movements rippled outward across the region. In the East Kimberley, informal settlements like Frog Hollow began forming as families left station work behind and established their own makeshift communities along dry riverbeds. These camps had no government infrastructure to speak of. Shelters were built from whatever corrugated iron and scrap materials were available. Sanitation was virtually non-existent, and residents relied almost entirely on their own resourcefulness and mutual support to survive. But what these camps lacked in resources, they made up for in something the pastoral stations never offered: autonomy. Communities that formed this way, including what would eventually develop into the modern town of Warmun, represented a decisive shift away from generations of pastoral dependency toward genuine self-determination. It was a difficult, uncertain transition, but it laid essential groundwork for the broader Aboriginal land rights movement that would gain significant legal and political traction in the decades that followed. From dry desert riverbeds shaped by self-reliance, we return to Victoria's lush Western District, where one community fought a slower, quieter, but no less determined battle. This one waged almost entirely through the courts. Framlingham was established in 1861 near present-day Moola Bulla as a reserve for the Gunditjmara people, on land that represented only a small fraction of their much larger traditional territory. Even that reduced allocation came under sustained pressure almost immediately, as neighbouring settlers repeatedly lobbied colonial authorities to open up reserve land for agricultural use. Over subsequent decades, the reserve was steadily whittled down through a series of administrative decisions, each one justified as reasonable land management, each one quietly reducing the community's already limited holdings. What makes Framlingham's story distinct is the persistence of the response. Rather than accepting each reduction as final, generations of Gunditjmara leaders and their descendants continued pressing legal and political claims to protect what remained and, eventually, to reclaim recognition of what had been lost. That sustained advocacy paid off. Framlingham remains Aboriginal-held land today, a rare outcome among Victoria's original reserves, achieved not through a single dramatic confrontation, but through generations of patient, determined legal pressure against the system explicitly designed to wear communities down. From a slow legal battle over acreage, we head north to the tropical top end, where one remote settlement became the unlikely stage for one of the most significant political moments in modern Australian history. Originally established as a ration depot and mission, and known for a time as Bamyeli, the settlement, now called Barunga, sits in the tropical savanna south of Katherine, serving as a meeting point for several distinct language groups across the region. For much of the 20th century, it functioned much like other remote missions, a place of government oversight, cultural disruption, and enforced dependency. In 1988, that quiet remote settlement became the center of national attention. During an annual community festival, Aboriginal leaders presented Prime Minister Bob Hawke with a painted bark petition that became known as the Barunga Statement, formally calling for a treaty recognizing Aboriginal sovereignty, land rights, and self-determination. Hawke publicly committed to pursuing a treaty in response. That treaty was never delivered. Decades later, the Barunga Statement remains one of the most significant unresolved commitments in Australian political history. Its promise still cited in ongoing national conversations about recognition and constitutional reform. Barunga is proof that a remote, largely overlooked settlement can still shift the trajectory of an entire nation's political conscience, even when the country isn't yet ready to follow through. In a political awakening in the top end, we now turn to one of the most harrowing chapters on this entire list, a facility built explicitly to separate children from everything they knew. Established in 1918 north of Perth near Mogamba, Moore River Native Settlement was overseen for years by A.O. Neville, the state's chief protector of Aborigines, a role that granted him sweeping legal authority over Aboriginal lives across Western Australia. Under his administration, Moore River became a central holding facility for children forcibly removed from their families as part of official assimilation policy, the system now known as the Stolen Generations. Conditions at the settlement were harsh by any measure. Overcrowding was common, mortality rates were troublingly high, and children were often kept behind fencing designed as much to prevent escape as to provide shelter. Accounts from survivors describe repeated escape attempts, including children walking extraordinary distances across unforgiving terrain in efforts to return home, journeys that became the basis for later widely known accounts of the settlement's history. Moore River represents the most institutionally explicit example on this list of a facility engineered not to house a displaced community, but to systematically dismantle family bonds under the guise of state welfare. It stands today as one of the clearest physical reminders of a policy that inflicted intergenerational trauma still deeply felt across Aboriginal communities in Australia. From a facility built to break families apart, we travel east to a river island where one community held its ground against relentless bureaucratic pressure to leave. Set on the Richmond River near Woodburn, Cabbage Tree Island became home to a Bundjalung community that established a farming settlement on the island's rich alluvial soil in the early 20th century. The land was fertile, but it was also vulnerable. Recurring floods repeatedly damaged homes and crops, forcing residents to rebuild again and again. Rather than offering meaningful support, the Aborigines Protection Board frequently used these hardships as leverage, citing health and safety concerns in repeated attempts to justify relocating or dispersing the community altogether. Residents pushed back, insisting on their right to remain on lands they had worked hard to cultivate, even as bureaucratic pressure mounted year after year. Cabbage Tree Island remains an active Aboriginal community today, a testament to residents who refuse to let repeated administrative harassment succeed where floodwaters hadn't. It's a quieter story than some of the others on this list, but it captures something essential about this entire history. Survival here wasn't just about withstanding nature. It was about outlasting a bureaucracy determined to see the community gone. For our final stop, we return to where this story of resistance truly began, to see what remains on the ground today. Near Hillsville, in the same forested valley where Coranderrk once stood as a thriving, self-sufficient community, only fragments remain today. After the station was formally closed in the 1920s and much of its land sold off, the physical structures were gradually lost to time, foundation stones overtaken by grass, orchard rows reclaimed by bushland, the outlines of buildings visible now only to those who know exactly where to look. What has not disappeared is the historical weight the site carries. A cemetery on the grounds holds the graves of Coranderrk elders and community members, including some of the very people who travelled to Melbourne in 1881 to testify against the injustices they endured. In recent decades, the site has been the focus of renewed heritage recognition and cultural centre development, an acknowledgement that the story this land holds was never actually finished, no matter how thoroughly the buildings themselves were dismantled. Standing among the quiet eucalyptus shadows here, it's difficult not to feel the layered weight of everything this list has covered. Success, resistance, destruction, and endurance, all converging in a single overgrown paddock outside a small Victorian town. 14 places, 14 very different fates. Some were burnt to the ground by police, some were fenced in to control children's lives from birth, some fought, organised, and won land rights victories that reshaped Australian law. What ties them together isn't a single narrative of tragedy or a single narrative of triumph. It's the sheer scale of deliberate effort that went into controlling, displacing, and in some cases, erasing Aboriginal communities across an entire continent. And yet, here's what's impossible to ignore. None of these places actually vanished. Foundation stones remain at Coranderrk. A treaty promise from Barunga is still cited in national political debate today. Cabbage Tree Island is still home to the descendants of the families who refused to leave it. Physical buildings crumbled, records were buried in archives, and maps stopped marking some of these towns entirely. But the communities, the memory, and the demand for recognition never actually disappeared. If any of this is new to you, that's worth sitting with for a moment, because it means a significant part of this country's history simply wasn't taught the way it should have been. If you know of other missions, reserves, or settlements with stories like these in your own region, share them in the comments below. Some of the most important history in this country isn't buried in the outback. It's sitting quietly in local archives, waiting for someone to ask the right questions.